No. The reason I'd say that economic stability is not a dream is that for quite a long time period after the Second World War, the economies of industrialised countries were remarkably stable. That period did have a number of physical advantages over our own: post-war rebuilding, good demographics, adapting a long backlog of technologies. Having said that, the remarkable stability that was achieved cannot be explained by high trend growth rates alone, simply because high growth rates almost always lead to speculation, bubble and bust. So the fact that that era managed to have very high trend growth rates without succumbing to speculation and bust for a 20-year period suggests that the regulatory structures of the era were working. Given that that's the case, there's no reason that we cannot adapt some of those lessons again. I would have to say that what I'm recommending is very far removed from communism. I'm in essence advocating classical social democracy, which I think many people have understood to be the best compromise for at least 60 years. In essence, a pure command economy doesn't work very well. A pure market economy doesn't work very well either. And as it turns out, a balance that takes elements from both is what works. I'd also say that there is a little bit of a tendency, and I think both the left and the right are guilty of this, to think that if you drift even 1 inch on the other side of the centre, then the next step is extremism, which it isn't.
The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works.
I would say that, for starters, the United States hasn't actually had greater economic health over the past 60 years. Trend growth rates in Europe in the 50s and 60s were actually about 4.5%. At the same time, the United States wasn't even managing 3%. It's only from the early 80s onwards that the United States has overtaken Europe. And that's largely because the United States unleashed speculative forces at the same time as Europe, for various reasons, was going through mildly deflationary forces. In relation to Britain, the trend growth rate of the United Kingdom before 1979 was 2.4%. The trend growth rate after 1979 was 2.4%. So from a GDP perspective, the Thatcher revolution simply didn't exist. And that's only looking at GDP. If you take basically any other social indicator that you care to think of, Britain and America lag far behind the other industrialised countries.
Around for 158 years and now crippled. Lehman Brothers isn't a conventional bank. It doesn't have...
I would say in a sense the writing has always been on the walls. Equilibrium theory in essence tells us that markets always come quickly and reliably back to balance. And I think observant commentators have always realised that there are other things going on, that there are things that drive markets away from balance. And I think what the 07 to 09 crisis did was to underline that point very dramatically and very painfully. So I think it will move us away from equilibrium theory permanently, hopefully, but it does have a tendency to come back repeatedly, unfortunately. The most important thing, the most fundamental thing, is to be empirical. The measure of a science is that it's tied to the evidence of the real world. Economics all too often seems to believe that equations make a science. It must give that up if it is to be classified with the other sciences. In terms of actually applying the empirical approach, what I recommend is to start from behavioural foundations, which are actually the linkages in your economic network, to then apply the concept of feedback, positive and negative, to infer how the economy overall will behave based on those behavioural foundations. And then finally, and critically, to go back to empirical methods, to test those predictions, to confirm that they do actually correspond to the evidence of the real world. I think a great deal of what can be salvaged of what's gone before. A lot of the concepts are reflective of the real world, and can be validated empirically. The problem is that they're precisely half of the story. So we can retain them, but there needs to be a second body of theory that essentially discusses the processes that drag economies away from equilibrium, whereas the existing body of theory focuses primarily on forces that draw the economy back to equilibrium. I think a very good example is currency pricing and exchange rates. It has been known for years that traders engage in essentially a phenomenon of trend following. If a currency appreciates, they believe that it will appreciate more, and therefore they buy it, which is of course a self-fulfilling prophecy in that it does actually drive the currency up. That process often leads to countries which actually have a trade deficit showing appreciating currencies for years, and conversely countries which have a surplus showing a depreciating currency for years. Clearly, self-fulfilling behaviour in the currency markets is driving the currency away from equilibrium. I would say that the term bubble in itself is extremely wide. It can be used to describe effectively anything that goes on in financial markets, whether it's shares, housing, the mispricing of currencies. In one way or another, they're all a bubble. If we're looking for something quite different, then something I've become interested in recently is something called price nucleation, which happens in essence when someone concocts, say, a new derivative instrument that no one can easily price. Usually after a period of time, someone comes along who believes that they have a model that will let them price it. Because it's the only model in the market, everyone starts using that. And in essence, that model comes to define the market price. Whenever the asset price deviates, people arbitrage back to what the model suggests is the correct price. Of course, that can't continue forever if the model isn't right. So eventually imbalances of one kind or another build up, and you see a very large market movement that brings the market essentially to a new price. And the first stage of that is in effect, again, a negative feedback process, whereby as soon as the trading price deviates from what the model suggests, behaviour brings it back again. I think in this case what the feedback perspective does is in essence to validate the truism. If you have a situation where advantage in wealth leads to advantage in the marketplace, and that leads to further advantage in wealth, then you very clearly have a feedback loop underway that will only lead to vast excess inequality if there isn't intervention to interrupt the process. So in essence, the feedback perspective is validating the cliché. In practical terms, I think recognising that there is a feedback loop of that kind tells you that there are multiple levels at which you can intervene. And in fact, if the loop sort of has multiple channels, then there may be many levels where you can intervene. I'll give a few examples. One way in which advantage in the marketplace can lead to increased inequality occurs in financial markets. In essence, those who are in the industry are part of a select group who, during speculative processes, are effectively bidding up the value of one another's assets. If financial markets are regulated better, and that process does not take place, then you've interrupted one of the loops through which advantage in wealth leads to advantage in the marketplace, and that leads to further advantage in wealth.